All right, so thanks everybody in the English department who have supported me and our creative writing faculty, and just anybody in any department who's been supportive of the faculty and all of our outside endeavors. It's really great to be a part of a community where we're invited to talk about the work that we do beyond the campus. I think it's important to be an educator who is informed in the world. And thanks to the administrators who have supported that work too. So I think talking about what I do sort of entails really what I've done and what I plan to do. And I guess trying to figure out what, instead of giving you a really long biographical history of myself, the best approach is to kind of identify some consistent themes in my life to explain the choices I've made. One is related to social justice and the other is related to story. For me, one story stands out very early on. I grew up in Georgia on the Bible Belt in a pretty typical white family that had, racist attitudes embedded in just our daily communal fabric. And, these sentiments were expressed in really seemingly benign ways through jokes or references. If something went wrong, you had a flat tire, then, you blamed it on a black person. Just very subtle and embedded, and you just learned also not to say those things when you went out. So this was part of my upbringing. But there was a moment where I was pretty young and I kind of recognized something odd about these things that I had been just conditioned to learn and embrace and understand and harbor as an attitude towards black people. It entailed, these things are very complex when we're trying to talk about them, but it entailed my grandfather, who was a very important figure for me when I was growing up. My mother was not very stable, so I always looked to my grandfather for stability and love and, just unconditional support. And he was one of the people, of course, who made these different statements throughout every day. I remember being in the grocery store with him once, and the checkout woman, I should say, was black, and I remember watching him flirt with her. And I was very young, I didn't even have the vocabulary at that point to recognize this feeling or to articulate what this feeling was, but it was a feeling that something hypocritical was going on. I knew that he said negative things about black people, and then I recognized that he was kind of valuing this woman in this sexualized way, and it made me feel very uncertain. But the point of that story is, I think there always comes a point in everyone's lives where we start to recognize that we are making choices, that we are determining who we are by the actions that we make. What we do says a lot about who we are, not just what we say. So, when it became clear to me that my choices began defining who I was, I started trying to figure out how do I address those. There was a lot of push-pull in my family. Do I just go along with what the family wants and what will keep me secure in the family, or do I speak out and say things and attempt to address what was certainly an unfair situation, an unjust situation? So just as in any story truly begins when the protagonist recognizes a conflict and begins to address how to correct that conflict. And some of us choose not to address that conflict, and that is a choice too. So that's where story and social justice kind of begin to converge for me. So anyway, what I do or don't do in the face of hypocrisies, inequality, and the need for justice is a large part of who I am. Jump ahead for me to my college education, where I started I was very fortunate to enter a program at Towson University, which is part of the Maryland system, where I was able to do a double major in English and women's studies. Now, I had just been working for the National Security Agency, the NSA, and I could be retired by now. But I didn't want to do that. I was uncomfortable there. I didn't like the way the institution was run, and I knew this at 17. They had gotten me young. I tested really well on something that they put out that was high for analytical abilities, and I was vetted and promised all these things, and I was finally like, I don't want to do this. So then I thought I might be an accountant, because that's what I did in high school. I went to a vocational school, and so by the time I got to college, I was like, no more of this technical stuff. I want to be a person in the world. And these classes, these liberal arts classes that you see, kind of, some of you might be aware, they're kind of under attack across the country right now, these different programs, these different departments, you know, because they don't produce some overt mechanic or nurse or whatever. But I'm a firm believer in we need to do more than just survive. We need to thrive. And so these classes make us well-rounded individuals. And for me, these classes were places to learn to really articulate what social justice means, how to work for it, who needs it. It gave me the vocabulary, and moreover, it gave me more perspective on other people's experiences. I learned about the value and elusiveness of fairness and equality in our country through the importance of story. And I'm not just talking about fiction, though that is one discipline that I studied. But I'm talking about essays, things that you all get in classes, and you, what is this? This isn't about me. And so often I hear something valued because I can relate to it, meaning it has something to do with me. But there's a real importance in reading other people's voices so that we can understand what their conditions are, what they've experienced, how they think. And that became really important to me. I took a lot of courses as an undergrad about people that had nothing to do with me. I took classes in African American studies, I took classes in Native American literature, I took classes in Eastern European literature, you know, other countries. And all of those things sort of informed me on thinking and empathizing beyond, you know, just my own experience. I mean, that's what empathy is learning to see how and feel how other people experience the world that we have in a way that we have not experienced it. And I think around this time with the Rodney King, do you guys remember the Rodney King beating by the LAPD police, and it caused the riots and stuff? He raised a question that a lot of people made fun of, but it was a really important and telling question. He just, after all this was happening, you know, and the cops were acquitted, of course, you know, he asked, why can't we all just get along? And it seems so simplistic, and it doesn't have a simplistic answer, but it is one of the main things that speaks to not just surviving, but thriving as a community, as a nation, together. And it was something that was stuck with me, because obviously, because of the importance of it. I mean, you all, at your age, have, you know, Trayvon Martin, but for me back then it was Rodney King that kind of was like, oh, these things actually, the things I'm studying in my classes actually happen in the world in a way that I haven't experienced. So one of the most important ways to affect change in the institutions and laws that perpetuate systemic bias is to change the attitudes and mindsets of the people who make up those institutions and create laws. That was something that I really recognized. You know, you can talk about reconfiguring all kinds of institutions, but the only way that those institutions can really be reconfigured are by people. People make the law, people make the educational systems that we go to, you know. And so we have to change people's minds, and that again is through story and literature. It's a primary mean. Literature is a primary means through which people hear others' voices and change their minds. I mean, think about it right now. It's really easy to what I call other people. You know, right now we see a lot of riots, or what are being dubbed riots right now in Baltimore. There were a lot of peaceful protests happening after the Freddie White, is that his name, Freddie White? Huh? The guy who was taken into custody and killed with back injuries, Freddie Gray, yeah. So there are a lot of protests over Baltimore right now that they're not even that publicized, and some of them have turned kind of ugly and violent with cop cars being destroyed and the police coming down hard on a lot of the protesters. And so it's easy to look down there and go, oh, look at all those black people on the streets just destroying their own properties. This is what I'm hearing from family members. And they can't see a larger picture. They can't ask themselves, what does it mean to have been disenfranchised all your life, not have economic opportunities, not have educational opportunities? And so it's easy for them to look and say, oh, so glad I don't live in Baltimore with all those black people right now doing these things. And so what do we do with these people? What do we do with family members? Do we just go along and say, yeah, you're right, and just be quiet? Or do we, for me, it's about speaking up and saying something in response. This is part of what I do. Do I always get it right? No, because I am always trying to listen and learn about experiences that are not my own, so that I can speak on behalf of people to those who will not listen to those people directly. Anyway, only when we begin to listen and hear the words do we learn about other people's conditions, understand their motivations, and imagine ourselves making the decisions they have to make daily. When we begin to engage them and recognize what they're grappling with and begin working to rectify the societal ills and conditions they are facing. So this is why my work as an educator, a poet, an activist, and especially with VIDA, is so important to me. I want to help people see through more than stereotypes. I want people to read beyond our own worldviews and imagine ourselves into others' shoes, their beliefs, their cultural practices, ways in which they attempt to address their own problems. What would you do if you were feeling under threat regularly by the police, if you were profiled regularly? What would you do? And I ask that sincerely, because I think that I would be very angry and probably not handle it as well as a lot of people do who have experienced it regularly. I am quick to anger, I know that about myself. I'd probably be one of those people locked up. So anyway, that said, I think it's really important to start figuring out strategic ways to do activism in the world. When I was younger, when I was your ages, as an undergrad especially, I was doing a lot of what you call on-the-ground activism. I was doing counter marches and protests and clinic defenses, going to abortion clinics and defending them against, the powers that want to destroy them. I even did some illegal actions, nothing terrible, just defacing property with statements and things like that. Did I say that on camera? But that was when I had a lot more energy, and I've done marches here in my 30s and stuff, but as I get older, I'm getting more, I need to put my energy elsewhere, and I can't risk arrest anymore, and I've got dogs that rely on me if I get arrested. I'm kidding. If there was something, it was tempting to go down during the other stuff a couple years ago. Anyway, so to talk a little bit about what I do with VIDA, since I'm talking a little bit about what I do as an educator already, and they're kind of related. I don't know if any of you are aware of what VIDA is. It's actually an organization that I helped found about 6 years ago with a number of other women. I mean, I didn't actually start it, but I joined the group and started working immediately with them. One of the primary things VIDA is known for is what's called our VIDA counts. The initial counts were ones where we looked at gender in publishing, and we have a newer one now where we look at race in publishing. We're trying to broaden these counts so that we can progress conversations around these counts and what they mean, so that they're intersectional, meaning they look at, we look at how different sociological factors intersect and are oppressed in different ways or treated with bias. I'll just read you VIDA's mission real fast. VIDA's mission as a research-driven organization is to increase critical attention to contemporary women's writing, as well as further transparency around gender equality issues in contemporary culture. And now we need to add race into that. In other words, we want to reveal lopsided reading lists and tables of contents that mostly provide platform to a very limited set of voices. Can you imagine who those limited set of voices are, even just on maybe your own reading lists? Any ideas? Who's been taught, what is the canon? You guys are taught the canon, generally speaking, of literature. Anybody have an idea what that is? It's typically a bunch of dead white old men who have written a lot of classics, and they get perpetuated as the classics. And that's problematic, because literature should really include a plurality of voices. This is not about eliminating white men. This is about decreasing the idea that white men speak universally for everyone's experiences in literature, and adding in a lot of different viewpoints, a plurality of voices. And our syllabi should reflect that, and our reading practices should reflect that. Specifically, the VIDA count reveals major imbalances at premier publications. These really matter to writers especially when you're submitting your work, both in the US and abroad. So for example, the New York Review of Books covered 306 titles by men in 2010 and only 59 by women. The New York Times Book Review covered 524 books by men compared to 280 by women. I mean, are women writing in fewer numbers than men? Do you guys think that? There are more men writing than women? No, not at all. This is just this last year's, well, you can see here, the New Yorker. They really like their white dudes, 563 men, 280 women. Again, women make up 51% of the population, and I feel quite certain that women are writing in as similar proportion as men. So one of the things Vita does is we call it starting the conversation. We prove the numbers exist, that the disparity exists. And of course we call for parity, which does not mean it has to be equal across the board, but there should be some sort of more clear balance. But beyond that, we've tried to start a public conversation asking, why do these things happen? Why are editors publishing in these huge numbers, men instead of, why aren't women being overpublished or whatever? And a lot of the speculation runs from editors choosing from their Rolodexes and their staple of writers instead of soliciting beyond their usual groups. Some people say women don't submit as much because they're doing a lot more of the domestic work still. There are a lot of different speculations, but nonetheless, it has